Tervetuloa tähän Lähi-idän murroksessa webinaarisarjan toiseen jaksoon. Tänään keskustelemme Israelin vastaisesta Apartheid-kampanjasta, jonka edistämisessä kansallisjärjestöt ovat olleet avainasemassa. Koska vieraamme tänään ovat israelilaisia asiantuntijoita, vaihdan kielen tässä vaiheessa englantiin, mutta suomenkielinen tekstitys on aktivoitavissa asennusrattaasta ruudun alareunassa. Welcome to this second episode of Middle East in Transition webinar series. Tonight we discuss the NGO campaign accusing Israel of apartheid against Palestinians. I'm Varpu Haavisto, the chairman of an NGO called YAPS, Young Adults for Peace, Justice and Solidarity in the Middle East. My guests tonight are Mrs. Naomi Kahn, the director of the International Department of Regavim, welcome, and Mr. Shaun Sacks, senior researcher at NGO Monitor, welcome, Shaun. And Mr. Maurice Hirsch, Lieutenant Colonel of IDF and the former chief prosecutor in the military courts in Juudean and Samaria. Welcome.
Thank you. Hi.
Thank you all for coming as my guests tonight to discuss this, unfortunately not so pleasant topic. Now, in the beginning of February, Amnesty International published its report called Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, Cruel System of Domination and Crime Against Humanity. With this report, Amnesty joined with a number of small radical pro-Palestinian NGOs which have been spreading these accusations since the beginning of this century. It's clear to anyone who bothers actually to read the report that it sets out serious accusations with harsh legal and other consequences against Israel. But at the same time, it completely bypasses Israel's perspective on the conflict. On the contrary, it completely ignores the scope of the violence faced by Israel and does not even mention Palestinian terrorism on its nearly 300 pages. In this webinar, we want to hear from Israeli experts about the veracity of the allegations and evidence presented as proof of the existence of apartheid in Israel. We will continue on the same topic at the next webinar, which will be held on next Tuesday, March 29th at 7 p.m. That will be a live broadcast in Finnish on this YouTube channel, and we invite you with your questions and comments to participate in the discussion. And the last webinar in the series will be held on Thursday, March 31st at 7 p.m. in this YouTube channel. Now, I think we have to start with the concept of apartheid, because I think some of our listeners may not have a clear idea what it means and where the concept comes from. So can I ask, would you, Shaun, like to explain briefly what was the South African apartheid about?
Right. Well, apartheid originated in South Africa. Officially, it began in 1948 when the white government officially took over the running of the country. And it instituted a policy of separation, specifically separation between races. The white minority was determined to maintain power over the ethnic Black majority and other races. And so they set about creating a legal system that separated the country into different racial classes. At the very top of this racial class were whites, and then underneath that at the very bottom were Blacks, but there were also other racial classes. People of mixed descent were regarded as colored, and descendants of Indians that had come over initially as slaves were regarded as people of Indian race. And furthermore, in addition to classifying people based on the color of their skin, either Black, white, or others, various other laws also prevented Blacks and whites from living in the same area, prevented Blacks from achieving certain levels of education, prevented Blacks from, like we said, living in certain areas, even visiting recreational places in certain areas, and even more so, the mixing of races, particularly marriage, and even later, even the simple act of love or having sex was forbidden by law. This was apartheid in its grandeur. Different people, my parents included, even when I was first born, my parents had to register me as a white person to ensure that I could live in a whites-only area. People who were Black, who were only allowed to sojourn or work in white areas as seasonal labor or or only live there for a limited period of time, because they were only limited to living in Black-only areas. And the entire system was really a system of racial domination, racial segregation, based solely on the fact that somebody was born with a different color skin. And this later led to, more importantly, it led to the fact that people who were not white were prevented from holding any type of legal office, or prevented from running for election, or even voting in any type of democratic election. This was apartheid. This was a terrible, cruel system that was imposed in South Africa. And eventually the system fell apart and South Africa transitioned into a democratic country.
Okay, well, apartheid is also used as a legal term in international law and defined as a crime against humanity. So
yes.
How is it actually defined in international treaties? And actually, what is Israel's position to these treaties?
Okay, so the legal terminology, I'll defer to Maurice in a minute, but I'll tell you the legal terminology of apartheid is very specifically, again, there are a number of international statutes that speak about this, and it very specifically speaks of racial segregation, where people of different races are separated based on the fact that they are different races. That is the crime of apartheid, and yes, it is a crime against humanity. And that is why, specifically international law, it is regarded as the separation of different races and categorizing of different races. In fact, the same legislation, the same legal frameworks that speak about apartheid as racial segregation, very specifically say this is about races, different races, people who are regarded as different races. It is not about people of different nationalities or anything else. That is also, and then as you'll see throughout the discussion, that many of these so-called human rights groups have a problem in that they realize they can't define Jews as a race, or they're quite happy to define Jews as a race, in which case we have another huge problem, because that leads us back to the dark days of Europe less than 70, 80 years ago. So instead they have to come up with new definitions that apply uniquely to Israel and don't necessarily rely on international definitions or racial segregation.
Yeah. So let's discuss about this effort to apply the concept of apartheid to Israel and to Israel-Palestinian conflict. As I read this report, I noticed one big trend that distorted the whole picture, namely both the history and the current situation, as well as Israel's actions, are described as if there were no real violence and no terror against Israel and Israelis. I will read for you one extract or some extracts from the report and want to hear your reaction to this. This is a quote. In September 2000, Palestinians launched a second intifada against Israel's military rule in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. During the uprising, which ended 2005, Israeli forces killed Palestinians unlawfully by shooting them during protests and at checkpoints, although they were not posing imminent danger. They also bombed residential areas and carried out extrajudicial executions. Palestinian armed groups and individuals deliberately killed Israeli civilians by placing bombs in crowded places and in drive-by shootings, both in Israel and in occupied territories. In response, the Israeli authorities collectively punished the occupied territories' entire population by imposing severe restrictions on movement and demolishing hundreds of Palestinian homes. And this goes throughout the report. They speak about non-violent popular resistance, like this is a quote, Palestinians in the occupied territories have mobilized and organized non-violent popular resistance against Israel's military occupation, which has been systematically met with excessive and unlawful force, arbitrary arrests and prosecution in military courts, as well as undue restrictions on freedom of movement. And during the protest, demonstrators often resort to low-level violence, throwing stones and rocks at Israeli soldiers, but without posing any serious risk to them. So, Maurice, is this an accurate picture of what's going on and what happened in the second intifada?
Maurice, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'll just take it off. So thank you for the question. I think we have to really start basically with the word and the use of the word intifada. The word intifada. Intifada means a popular uprising. This was not a description of what happened starting September 2000. What happened starting September 2000 is a Palestinian Authority initiated wave of terror, the use of violence and terrorism in order to achieve political gains. That's what the story was. It wasn't a few children getting up and throwing stones. It was systematic use of weapons that had been provided to the Palestinian Authority that were then turned on the Israeli civilian population in order to carry out extensive murders. We're now in the month of March. If you look back at the month of March 2002, for example, you will see that there were over 120 Israelis murdered during that month of March alone through a series of terrorist attacks, explosions in cafes, 9 people killed, explosions on buses, explosions everywhere. This is not in any way, shape, or form peaceful resistance. This was all-out coordinated war, and it needed to be treated as such. It needed to be treated as all-out terrorism, and that's what Israel had to do. Now, Israel in that process implemented not a small amount of measures in order to save lives. Obviously, Amnesty sees everything as a punishment and as collective punishment. They talk extensively of the separation wall. Let's understand what the separation wall is. Even in Amnesty's understanding, Amnesty understands that Judea and Samaria, what they call the West Bank, should be Palestine. That should be the Palestinian state. And therefore, well, why shouldn't that be separated off from the rest of Israel if they accept that Israel has a right to exist? The problem is they don't accept that Israel has a right to exist. That's a whole different story. So when you have a slew, really a flow of, or never-ending flow of suicide bombers crossing over from the Palestinian cities in Judea and Samaria into the heartland of Israel, into the heartland of Israel's civilian population, and exploding themselves, how can it be seen as unreasonable to then build a barrier which would stem the flow of those human missiles? Amnesty doesn't accept that at all. Amnesty expects the Palestinians to be able to freely murder Jews without any implications. That's the bottom line of their analysis. When they talk about limitations on movement, well, if you have a certain city, for example, Nablus, Shechem, which was the source of scores of suicide bombers leaving each day, scores of other terrorists shooting at Israeli civilians, why would you not be able to impose measures which then save lives? Those life-saving measures obviously are considered by Amnesty across the board as a generalization of something which is clearly, as they describe it, a collective punishment. But they ignore entirely the analysis of international law, which in circumstances where they themselves claim that the Fourth Geneva Convention applies to Judea and Samaria, the laws of war and the Fourth Geneva Convention included allow and provide for Israeli military forces to take security precautions and other measures in order to save lives. That, of course, they undermine, they don't accept, that they minimize, because it's all there. It's not designed to be an objective analysis of the situation, but rather a completely subjective demonization of Israel with no real substance standing under.
There's actually a large section in the report where Amnesty accuses Israel of inhuman ill treatments, inhuman acts towards Palestinians. And of course, most severe of those is torture. And let me read to you some extracts. Like, there's about torture. Torture and other ill treatment of Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories is widespread. For decades, Palestinian detainees, including children, have reported torture or other ill treatment. While Israel's Supreme Court in 1999 ruled that torture and other ill treatment were generally prohibited, it permitted interrogators to use physical interrogation methods in ticking bomb situations. Since the Supreme Court decision in 1999, Israeli interrogators have tortured hundreds of Palestinians, citing the ticking bomb plea. What do you say about this?
Well, you actually truly have to love the methodology of Amnesty. They make such a wide-ranging claim. They bring no evidence whatsoever.
Yeah.
Where are the testimonies? Where are the people who claim that they've been, as it were, tortured? Where is the evidence that they could show that? I don't know. There should be medical evidence from here until the moon. If there's been so many hundreds of Palestinians who have been tortured, where are those claims? Where is one committee that's actually found that those claims are justified?
Mm.
Unfortunately, they just make these wide-scoping claims, and really they have nothing to base themselves on. They claim that they're basing themselves on testimonies of Palestinian terrorists. So I can say categorically, I was the head of the prosecution for Juudean and Samaria for 3.5 years almost. Israel does not use torture. That's it. That is the bottom line and the truth of that story. It's an irrelevant subject as regards Israel. What do you do, on the other hand, when you have instances where, again, when you're talking about the situation of walking bombs really infiltrating into Israel's civilian population and blowing themselves up, killing themselves at will? How do you then deal with that situation when you have someone who has the information to save lives? Mm. In every circumstance, in almost every country, you have a defense that's called necessity, the use of force in order to receive information which can save lives. Mm. So Amnesty obviously would prefer that hundreds more Jews have been slaughtered by the Palestinian terrorists rather than Israel, God forbid, and defend itself against these terrorists.
If I could interject for one second on this subject, an interesting, let's say, a gap in Amnesty's reporting has to do with Palestinian Authority use of torture and other inhumane and inhuman acts against its own population. There have been numerous documented cases of Palestinians who have been tortured or killed by the Palestinian Authority's security forces themselves. As a matter of fact, the organization that I work for was among those who had to help pay for medical documentation, tests and documents for some of the victims who sued the Palestinian Authority for damages, the victims or their families, in cases where they were actually murdered by the Palestinian Authority through the use of horrific torture. All of this is documented in court cases, and the Palestinian Authority obviously refused to recognize them, and the courts in Israel actually got involved. These people sued the Palestinian Authority in Israeli courts, and they had no means of producing documentation and had to begin the process of documenting the Palestinian Authority's use of torture and inhumane treatment of its own population. These things were proven in Israeli courts and well documented. No such thing happens in terms of Israel. It's simply, it's a fabrication. It's a blood libel. And the truth is quite the opposite.
Yeah, I see this report is very, very one-sided. I mean, nothing is told, which is like something the Palestinians should do better. So, but since Naomi, you are there, I would like to talk about this section. There's a large section in the report about the land ownership, house demolitions, discriminatory planning policy, etc. And I'd like to ask whether the report is really based on facts. I read one extract to you. Israeli officials have discriminated in the application of planning laws and policies in the Negev, East Jerusalem, and Area C of the West Bank. They strictly enforce planning prohibitions where Palestinian houses are built and freely allow amendments to plans to promote development where Israeli authorities are setting up Jewish cities in Israel or Israeli settlements in occupied territories. When Palestinians build houses illegally because they cannot obtain planning and building permits, the houses are destroyed. Demolitions continue today and are usually carried out for three main reasons: unlicensed building, alleged military or security needs, or as punishment. Is this factual?
It's actually nonsense. It's less than factual. What Amnesty and Peace Now and various other organizations of this ilk love to do is to quote percentages without quoting numbers. They quote percentages, for example, of the percentage of building permit requests submitted by the Palestinian Authority or individual Palestinians that are actually approved by the State of Israel's planning authorities, either in civil administration or elsewhere. We're talking generally about Area C. This is their favorite statistic, and they quote the statistic widely. But what does the statistic really say? It says that their lawfare campaign against the State of Israel is extremely successful. What does that mean? It means that the European Union and the United Nations and European donor states fund to the tune of hundreds of millions of euros planning permit requests that they know 100% will never be approved. If you ask for a building permit on an archaeological site or in a nature reserve or within the municipal lines of an existing Jewish community, you know very, very well that those building permit requests are going to be rejected. And they drag this through the courts for years. And then they say, oh, look, they've only approved a very small percentage of our building permit requests. And that is because they flood the system purposely in order to skew those numbers. So yes, the percentages are very small, because they have an unlimited source of funding to submit nonsensical, unfeasible, ridiculous permit requests. So that's first of all. Second of all, the question of building permits begs a much larger question. In the Oslo framework, in the current framework, which is international law, the Palestinian Authority has all the rights and all of the abilities to approve construction for Palestinians in areas A and B. We simply mapped out the area and saw that almost 70% of their land resources in those areas are completely empty, and they're available, and they could solve their housing problems for the next 100 years by using their resources legally in areas already under their jurisdiction. Instead, they use all of their resources to build politically, illegally, in strategic areas under Israeli jurisdiction in order to seize control of those areas and in order to create a black eye for the State of Israel if and when, on those rare occasions, Israel actually does demolish illegal structures. Now, the construction in Area C, when you look at the map, and this is what we do, when we look at the map and we see what the pattern is that emerges from this illegal construction, you can see where it's built and where it is not, where resources are being used and where they are not. It is clearly a political, strategic construction. At present, we have documented 72,247 illegal structures built by the Palestinians in the areas under Israeli jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. The number of demolitions doesn't even scratch the surface. Mm-hmm. And each time it entails years of lawfare, as I mentioned. Protecting the illegal structures is another place that the Europeans fund very, very heavily. They actually build into their contracts with the Palestinian Authority subcontractors clauses and expenses for the legal protection of illegal construction, because they know very well that what they're doing is illegal. And these are European countries that have full diplomatic relations with the State of Israel, and they do this anyway. The State of Israel has not found a way to address this construction warfare, but it is warfare. It is just a different means of fighting the State of Israel, but it's been very, very effective. So essentially, the two main claims are A, that the State of Israel approves a very, very small percentage of building permits by Palestinians. That is true, because the very vast majority are nonsensical claims, nonsensical permit requests. And second, that they have no choice. They have to build there because they have nowhere else to live, which is patently false because 70% of areas A and B are still available, and they don't need any Israeli approval for any of those things.
There are actually so-called case studies in this report. So there was a case study about the Bedouin village al-Hiran in Negev, and then something about Silvan in East Jerusalem. Do you want to comment those case studies? Have you read them?
Yes, indeed. al-Hiran, actually, the case is a case that we took to court, documented the completely fictitious narrative that they created of a historic village, etc., etc. Simply put, it's illegal construction. Now, again, the report blurs the lines between areas A, B, C, and Israel proper. al-Hiran is the Negev. It is part of Israel proper. And it is state land. It is land for which Bedouin in the area were given over a decade to present any documentation to support or substantiate claims of ownership. They never did so because they simply don't have any. And even if you have a situation where a person has private ownership of a piece of land, that doesn't mean you can build whatever you want without permits. We live in a modern, organized country, or would like to at least. And that means that before you can build, even on property that you own, you have to have engineering reports. You have to have proper hookups to infrastructure, sewage, electricity, water. You have to have roads. You have to have some sort of geological study to show that you are building up to standards for all sorts of environmental issues, for natural disasters, and that you're not taking someone else's property. All of those things are crucial to the normal development in any normal country. And it is equally true in the state of Israel. Despite what Amnesty says, I personally, any other Jewish resident of this country, just because whether or not I own land, I can't just build whatever I want. Certainly, I can't just take a piece of state-owned land and build on it. And certainly, by claiming simply that I own it, it doesn't make it mine. Yeah. So the state of Israel has this, this is essentially what it's facing in the Negev. The issues, the Amnesty report, for example, quotes extensively that the skewed numbers that they like to play with in terms of private ownership of land, that the state of Israel, in 1948, a certain percentage of land was, the vast majority of land was owned by Arabs, and now the vast majority is owned by Jews, and claim that this is proof of Israel's apartheid and somehow it's abuse of the Arab population. These are all ridiculous statistics. The state of Israel at present is more or less like every other organized country in the world. The percentage of land that is owned privately by private individuals or institutions, somewhere in the area of 7%. And that 7% of land, it's the same, I assume, in Finland and in most other places. It's true in the United States, it's true in Great Britain. The vast majority of land in almost every country is owned by the state. But the interesting thing in Israel is that of the 7% that is owned privately, the majority of that 7% is owned by the 20% minority Arab population. So all of these claims of apartheid and of disenfranchisement and of abuse of their property rights are completely false.
Another interesting thing is in this report is the sources it uses. I noticed a huge amount of the citations referred to B'Tselem, Peace Now, Adalach, Human Rights Watch, Al-Haq, UN OCHA, and quite many were to Amnesty's own reports. And one reference was even to Electronic Intifada. Shaun, are these sources reliable, objective sources?
Well, this is something we see a lot. It's what we call an NGO echo chamber, where these same organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, Al-Haq, all of them work together and they create these same type of reports, and therefore they all will quote one another. Amnesty will quote Human Rights Watch will quote B'Tselem will quote Al-Haq. And then what happens is all of them then work together and present the same type of reporting to the United Nations. And then the United Nations will quote them again. And we have this situation where we have it going over and over again. So the United Nations quotes Al-Haq quotes the United Nations quotes B'Tselem, B'Tselem quotes Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Watch quotes Amnesty, who quotes B'Tselem and Human Rights Watch all over again. And so nobody actually looks into, wait a minute, aren't these people just quoting one another? And unfortunately, nobody's really looking into that. And then when we look into the actual case studies of what they're quoting, we see not only are they all quoting one another, they're all using the exact same examples. And as Naomi has already said, when we look at those examples, we see that they're highly problematic. And if you were to look at them slightly with a more slightly open mind, you'd see that the situation is far more complex than they're actually saying. And that goes back to these same NGOs have a very particular and peculiar agenda that is clearly against the Jewish state, but that is never questioned.
Yeah, it's interesting that they use these, like each other's reports as evidence. So and also as you talk about the case studies, I paid also attention to the case studies of individuals in this report. They show quite interesting individuals and cases as examples of Israel's so-called racial oppression. Do you want to comment some of those? Or any of those case studies? Like people who are as examples, taken as examples of racial oppression.
Well, there's a couple of times where we've seen where they speak about examples of oppression, and the same examples they use are the same examples used in some cases by other NGOs. They also, in a couple of cases, the people that they're used as examples are workers in some of the NGOs that we've spoken about. And most importantly, the fact that they're constantly using the term racial abuse, etc. And that goes back to another claim that specifically Amnesty International uses, is Jewish domination. Now, if you type into Google today, well, if 6 months ago you went to Google and you typed in the word Jewish domination, your entire web search would be to pro-Nazi groups and conspiracy websites about the protocols of the Elders of Zion or Jews trying to take over the world. That is where the term Jewish domination comes from. But here, Amnesty International has taken that exact same terminology used by the most horrendous anti-Semites around the world and turned it into something to describe Israel. So the terminology that it used to be recognized as blatant anti-Semitism, you would refer to Jewish domination and Jews trying to take over the world. Now as long as you say, well, I'm only talking about Israel, and Israel is an apartheid state, suddenly it's okay to speak about Jewish domination.
What's interesting to note, Varpu, is it's not the names that they give of the case studies, but rather the names that they don't talk about. They don't talk about the Arab members of Knesset. They don't talk about, obviously, Black South Africans could never have been elected to the parliament. They don't talk about the Arab members of, or members of the judiciary, judges, including judges in Israel's Supreme Court. They don't talk about the Arab heads of departments in hospitals and every other walk of life. They don't talk about the major generals in Israel's IDF. They don't talk about the Arab Muslims who are commander-in-chief in Israel's police department. So they don't talk about the people who head the prison service. These are all the names that they, whilst bringing these so-called case studies of people who had been affected by Israel's domination and Israel's apartheid, they completely ignore the entire slew of other people. The Arab Israeli who sits on Israel's panel for appointing judges in Israel. They forget about Israel's Corona Czar at the moment, who is also an Israeli Arab. All of these people are obviously subject. You asked before, Shaun, the definition of apartheid in international law. It's amazing what they're talking about. The apartheid under international law, under the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, is an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination with the intent of maintaining that regime. Where is that regime in Israel?
I'd also like to point out a few other things that the Amnesty report does very, very subtly. And that is to paper over the difference between rights for its citizens and rights for non-citizens. They make one big, we call it a salad. You know, it's a salad here. We're not talking about, now apartheid always refers to discrimination of rights among citizens of any given country, and not whether or not that country is forced to give rights of any kind to non-citizens. Nowhere else in the world is a country expected to give full civil rights other than individual rights, to respect individual rights, but not national rights or other rights to non-citizens. And every country in the world has not only the right, but the obligation to protect its borders, to prevent infiltration, to protect its own citizens from acts of violence or other type of even political acts by non-citizens. So conflating the issues that have to do with Juudean and Samarian and the things that have to do, for example, with the Bedouin in the Negev, is one way of making this salad more like a soup and making it very, very difficult for people who are reading the report to separate between the issues. I'd also like to point out that one of the cases that they bring, the case of al-Khiran, which you mentioned, for example, we have extensive documentation, aerial photography of the development of this illegal construction there, as part of a general issue of the rights of Bedouin citizens in the Negev. Extensive documentation and court cases and aerial photos, all this can be found on our website. This is just a small example of dozens and dozens of clusters of illegal construction by citizens of Israel who are Bedouin citizens of Israel. One of the things that Amnesty likes to claim is this somehow almost genocidal suppression of population or deportation or limiting the ability of these communities to thrive, et cetera, et cetera. And I would point out that the Bedouin population of the Negev, Israeli citizens, Bedouin Arab citizens of the Negev, that sector is the fastest growing population in the world on planet Earth, doubles in size every 15 years. So either we're not doing a very, very good job, or there really just is none of this oppression that actually exists. I would also note that in the populations, the Palestinian population in Judea and Samaria has grown tremendously. The Arab population of Jerusalem has grown tremendously. There is no indicator that would possibly support the wild claims that Amnesty tries to level or places between the lines in subtext so that it can't be attacked, but this oppression simply does not exist.
And also, if we talk about the victims of violence there, then one can also ask, why isn't there any case studies of Israeli victims of Palestinian terror? I guess their number has increased dramatically since the beginning of the so-called peace process and establishment of Palestinian self-government. So this is also completely absent. So this one-sidedness of the report is very obvious.
Yes, but it's an unfortunate confluence, I think, if we're going to talk about why it is that people don't see those numbers.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate because the state of Israel doesn't like to portray itself as a victim, and successive governments, particularly from the parties that signed the Oslo Accords and moved forward on the disengagement and all of these other things, they like to portray, they don't want to admit failure. They don't want to admit, in many, many cases, that what they called the victims of peace far outweigh the benefits of whatever this peace has brought us in many specific metrics that we're going to look at. But I would point out that recently, very, very quietly and without much fanfare, the Swiss government announced that it would no longer be funding the Geneva Initiative, simply because nobody's listening. and there's no partner for peace. And they have essentially admitted that the Palestinian Authority simply isn't interested. It got what it could out of those initiatives and out of that framework. So now the person who dreamed up that framework, which is Yossi Beilin, is now trying to promote a new framework. And he's running around various capitals around the globe to try to drum up support for his new initiative, which will take the place of the Geneva Initiative, which essentially led to a brick wall, exploding buses, and quote unquote victims of peace on the Israeli side. So that's something that they are keeping very, very quiet.
Shaun, I would like to ask you about the background of this apartheid campaign. What are the actors behind it, and also who has welcomed this report and who has condemned it? It's also interesting.
Well, the background to this report actually goes to Durban 2001. I've spoken many times, and we will continue to speak about Durban 2001 was the UN conference against racism and xenophobia. Appropriately, it was held in Durban, South Africa after the end of apartheid, and it was supposed to be a conference that dealt with these issues of racism, of even anti-Semitism, etc. But very quickly, this conference devolved into an anti-Israel festival of hate. It was attended by over 1,300 different NGOs. And rather than deal with real issues of hatred around the world, the NGO conference focused uniquely and exclusively on Israel and deemed Israel as an apartheid racist state. And it began the process of comparing South African apartheid to Israel. And many of these same NGOs that today are at the forefront of the Israel apartheid campaign were present in Durban at the very beginning of this process. And we've been watching for over 20 years how many of these NGOs very quickly moved away from being actual human rights groups or human rights activist groups to becoming and adopting a purely anti-Israel narrative. So the fact that only now they're openly using the word apartheid to describe Israel is no surprise. It's been in the works for 20 years. In fact, Amnesty International acknowledges in their own report that the Durban conference was a starting point for the boycott, divestments, and sanctions process, which compared Israel to apartheid South Africa. And the very next logical step from going from boycotts, divestments, and sanctions is to call Israel an apartheid state. Again, many of the NGOs are very open about the fact that it is a process. So they went from Durban to BDS to apartheid, and we knew that was, and we saw this coming. Human Rights Watch did it, Amnesty International was very open about it, and we've seen many of the Palestinian NGOs going that way. And unfortunately, again, many of the Israeli-funded NGOs are also heading in that very same direction with a lot of European funding.
So many people are asking, why would Amnesty International do something like this if it's not in good faith? It's, how do they benefit from this? Right?
Well, the answer is exactly it. Amnesty International for many, many years has been floundering. They've lost a lot of support, they've lost a lot of money, and they need a new campaign to actually latch onto to increase their profile. And Israel for many, many years has been a very easy way to score political points to get new funders. And so they jumped on this. Just to give you an example, 5 years ago, Amnesty International held a major conference where their board was asked to vote on a number of major human rights issues, including what they called at the time the threat against Muslims and Islamophobia and various human rights violations around the world. They were also asked to condemn and to deal with and to run some type of campaign against anti-Semitism. Amnesty International's board voted on every single issue except anti-Semitism. They openly said it's the only thing they just don't have time for. And that was 5 years ago. Now, 5 years down the line, they've written a massive report against Israel. Their latest report. Previously, they wrote a report saying, believe it or not, that there is no actual Jewish ties to Jerusalem or other historical areas. But getting around to anti-Semitism, they still haven't been able to write a report about that. Yes, they've issued 3 statements and made a few tweets, but real reports on anti-Semitism, we're still waiting. But
what about then Israeli organizations like B'Tselem and others?
So can I interject?
Yes.
There's a new campaign. Anyone who follows the news coming out of Israel, and I'm sure it reaches all the way to Finland, but it's certainly magnified in the United States and in Great Britain. There's a whole new genre called settler violence. Over and over and over again, you will see articles about settler violence and this wave of settler violence and increased settler violence against unfortunate Palestinians. The campaign is actually quite a lot more insidious than that. It not only delegitimizes the Jewish presence in Judea and Samaria, it actually blames the IDF for participating or for standing by or for allowing or enabling settlers to attack Palestinians. So there are 2 things about this increasing coverage and this whole campaign that are really fit into the same picture. It's one element of this delegitimization campaign. It delegitimizes, it really kills 2 birds with 1 stone, as we like to say, and that is both the settlers and the settlement enterprise, and by extension, the quote-unquote occupation army, which is the IDF. So statistics actually released by the Israel police and by other first responder organizations on the ground prove, without any shadow of a doubt, that violence from the side of Jews in Judea and Samaria against Palestinians has actually decreased significantly over the past few years. That's number 1. And number 2, you begin to wonder, so then why is this all in the press and all of this? Well, it turns out that the European Union funded an organization, an Israeli NGO called Breaking the Silence, gave them 1 million shekel to create this campaign, specifically settler violence that is being enabled and fueled by IDF complicity. So they have 1 million shekel that they have to use in order to get their salaries. And what they do is they pay local quote unquote activists to create confrontations, and they document them, and then they send it off to the press. Now, Breaking the Silence.
Yeah, it's a beneficial business for them then.
It is big business. It is big.
But I want to.
I just want to point out that Breaking the Silence receives its funds, aside from the European Union, it receives its funds from the same organizations that fund B'Tselem and Now and Adala and all of these other organizations that are part of this larger campaign. They were given money despite the fact that they were discredited, and that the EU itself found in previous years that Breaking the Silence simply fabricated stories that never happened. And nonetheless, they were paid now 1 million shekel to essentially fabricate, to stage and create all of these new stories as well. So
I've seen videos of those staged situations. So where you can see that there's really staged. So, but let's go.
What's important to point out there, if I could just interject for a second, is something that Naomi mentioned, but has to be stressed. Many people use the argument that, well, most of the claims being raised by Amnesty and Human Rights Watch are also raised by Israeli organizations, such as Breaking the Silence and everything else. You have to understand what this is. This isn't Israeli organizations. These are foreign-funded organizations in which, incidentally, Israelis happen to work, and they function in Israel's very vibrant democracy. That's an Israeli organization. These are foreign governments paying for services that suit their political agenda, and should never be confused with an Israeli organization that truly condones or even really exposes any of these things which they're claiming Israel has done.
So
Varpu, do you mind if sorry, we're on this topic. I'm just going to bring. I'm just going to go one step further. We spoke about all these organizations a number of times, and earlier we'd spoken about an echo chamber, how they all work off each other. So at NGO Wonder, one of the things we've seen is B'Tselem, Breaking the Silence, Adala, and many others are approached by the European Union and the European governments, or they work together with the idea of they come up with a plan for dealing with human rights in the future. So these organizations write up a plan and send it to the European Union. The European Union says, oh, this is a great idea. We'll give these same organizations money to carry out the plan. And then a year later, after they receive millions from the European Union, they write a new plan and saying, well, for whatever reason, generally because of Israel did this wrong, we're going to need more money to create a new plan to tell you how bad Israel is. So you can give us more money so we can create a new plan to tell you how bad Israel is. And so we've got this circle that goes over and over again, where the European Union and various European governments are consistently paying these NGOs to write reports about how bad Israel is, so that they can get more money to write reports about how bad Israel is.
Yeah, and it's an incredible flow of money from Europe. I mean, it's really shameful. But I would like to talk about the consequences of these reports, because people might think that, okay, these are only words, they have no consequences. But reading the Amnesty report, it concludes with a list of recommendations for Israel and Palestinian Authority and international actors. And there are about 50 demands on Israel. For example, that it should receive millions of Palestinian refugees, dismantle the security fence, and let people and goods move freely across Gaza borders. In comparison, it makes 2 recommendations to Palestinian Authority, which are document Israel's system of apartheid against the Palestinian population, provide evidence to international courts and other bodies, and ensure that any type of dealings with Israel, especially security coordination, does not contribute to maintaining the system of apartheid. It's a ridiculous unbalance. 50 demands for Israel and these 2 recommendations for Palestinian Authority. And at the same time, it demands, among other things, that the UN Security Council and all UN member states impose a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel, which should cover all military and security equipment and assistance. That means I get also all defensive material. So what would be the consequences of implementing these recommendations?
I think the consequences are very, very clear. The goal of Amnesty's recommendations is the annihilation of the Jewish state, of a Jewish homeland, anywhere on the globe. For Amnesty, every nation, every people in the world has a right to self-definition and ready for its own purposes. Amnesty completely undermines the right of the Jewish people for self-determination. Every other people in the world has it, only the Jews don't have it. The goal is to destroy Israel, flood Israel with millions of Palestinian refugees. The goal, democratically destroy Israel, take away the security barrier. The goal, open Israel to Israel's civilian populations to unending human missile attacks, attacks from Gaza, attacks from Judean and Samaria. Do everything possible in order to destroy the state of Israel. That's their only goal. That is the clear goal of the entire report and definitely of its recommendations. And that has to be seen clearly for what it is. Everything else, the pretense that they're discussing any type of human rights should be seen for what it is. It's just a fallacy. Palestinians have rights to murder Jews. Jews don't have rights to defend themselves. That's the equation that Amnesty's report is providing to the world. That is the consequences of their recommendations. That is Amnesty's goal, destruction of Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people.
Yeah.
I'd also like to point out one other interesting thing that unfortunately, the Amnesty report starts, as always, they choose to start their history from a very specific time and place. But they carry on at length in this report about how the Palestinians are stateless people. They and under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone has a right to nationality. Of course, they're trying to deny that right to the Jews, but that's a topic for another day. Why is it that the Palestinian residents of the Palestinian Authority are stateless people? They forget to mention that they all had citizenship of a proper, internationally recognized country until that was rescinded unlawfully, and that is the violation of international law. Who rescinded their citizenship? Jordan. Jordan essentially in 1988 unlawfully removed its citizenship from all Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria, and is gradually rescinding citizenship of people of Palestinian extraction living on the eastern side of the Jordan. That is what is illegal. So none of the recommendations actually address the true core, the basis for the violation of political rights for these people, because their violation of political rights doesn't come from us. It comes actually from Jordan. And the fact that the international community is going to look the other way and allow Jordan to create millions of stateless people in violation of international law, you'll have to ask them why that is, that there's no Amnesty International report about that. There's also a very bizarre attempt to ignore the Palestinian Authority's reason for existence to begin with, and that is to create civilian life for Palestinians in the areas under its jurisdiction. So why is it that there are no recommendations for the Palestinian Authority, A, to relinquish all its, well, I won't say relinquish, let's say, why is there no demand on the Palestinian Authority to develop the 70% of its land reserves and resolve the housing issues, if there are any actually, for the people living under its jurisdiction? Why has it completely forgotten to mention that the Palestinian Authority hasn't held elections as according to its very, very most basic mandate we're going
17 years.
17 years, it's going on 2 decades. No recommendation about that. No recommendation about imprisonments or summary, no recommendations about executing people who are guilty of the crime of selling land to Jews. None of these things are part of Amnesty International's recommendations for the Palestinian Authority. The only recommendations they have are new ways in which to attack and delegitimize the state of Israel. So,
and most fundamentally, no recommendation that the Palestinian Authority stop spending almost $300 million a year rewarding terrorists, paying financial rewards to terrorists. That's just an unbelievable oversight of Amnesty International's report. Imagine paying people. If there was a system in the world where you were paid a financial reward for murdering a black person, the world would obviously be an outcry. That's not apartheid. That's worse than apartheid. But that system exists in the Palestinian Authority. By law, they pay financial rewards to people who murdered Jews. Yes. Amnesty is silent. Yes. That's unbelievable.
Yes.
Varpu, I just want to bring up, I think everything that was said before was absolutely right. I'm going to bring up 2 other points that I think are very important.
Yes.
Before the report was made public, Amnesty International released it to journalists to try and get as much information to get as much media possible. And in the report, twice, Amnesty's report actually says, and I want to quote you, the system of apartheid originated with the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948. So there's their act, there's them telling exactly what they want. According to them, apartheid, this horrible, evil system, started with the creation of Israel in 1948. Very interestingly, in the report that was made official, which was printed on a couple of pieces of paper, afterwards, they changed that language. Amnesty International realized very quickly that even though they'd spent 4 years writing this report, maybe that was giving it away too much. But obviously, the Amnesty officials knew the truth, because just last week, Paul O'Brien, the head of Amnesty International in the United States, said the following. he was asked, should Israel exist as a Jewish state? And he said, and I'm going to quote him, no, it should not exist as a Jewish state. So there's your answer. Amnesty International can put together any type of recommendations they want, and they can use language, but at the end of the day, they see the creation of Israel, the creation of the Jewish state as a problem, and their goal, like many of the other organizations, is the eradication of the Jewish state. They, unlike many organizations and unfortunately countries that for years have been trying to destroy Israel with violence and wars, they have adopted the tactic of trying to destroy Israel through quasi-legal means.
Yes. So, friends, our time is up. It's in conclusion, one can say that this report is not made in good faith. It has this political goal which you stressed, and we hope that we make it clearly understood also to our Finnish audience. But thank you all for this extremely interesting and revealing discussion, and peace, shalom to all of you.
Thank you.
Shalom, shalom. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.